Alright amigos, welcome to Amigos Code. In this video, I want to teach you exactly how to use Spring Boot 2.0. Spring Boot is by far one of the best frameworks for building applications in the Java world. So if you want to build an enterprise application, you can use Spring Boot, or if you want to prototype an idea and see whether it works, then you can use Spring Boot because it makes it very easy to build applications. And basically, Spring Boot provides you a platform for building back-end applications. And not only that, you can also build web applications as well. So in this video, let's go ahead and build this awesome API where any client can submit a request. So these requests could be a GET request, POST, DELETE, and PUT. And then we're going to take that request and within the API layer or control layer, so this is where we receive the requests, we're going to send that to the service layer. And basically the service layer is responsible to handle all the business logic that you may have within your application. After you perform some business logic, then you might decide to use a database to perform some various CRUD operations. And basically, so this layer right here, so this layer is responsible to connect to any database of your choice. So the cool thing about Spring Boot and dependency injection is that you can start with an implementation, and then if you want to switch to a different database, you simply have to change one line of code. And I'm going to show you exactly how to do that with dependency injection. So after you submit the actual request from any client, so the clients could be an iOS app, a React, or even an Android app, the request will go through all these layers and then go back with a response to the client. So the response could actually be, for example, a JSON payload or an image or a status code of 200, 500, so on and so forth. So if you want to learn the best framework for building Java applications, stick to this video because there is a lot to cover, and I'm pretty sure that after this video, you will be very comfortable building backend applications with Spring Boot. So let's go ahead and get started. So the very first thing that I want you to do is to navigate to this website, start.spring.io. And basically this website, you can see that it's titled Spring Initializer. It basically allows you to bootstrap your application by picking dependencies and configuring the actual project. So go ahead and generate a project with Maven, but you can see that you can pick Gradle, and then you have the option to code with Java, Kotlin, or Groovy. So I'm going to stick with Java. And then for the actual version, make sure that it is above 2.0. So I've got a video on 1.5, and basically I just want to make sure that you guys have the latest version so that you can use it within your latest projects. So then go ahead and click on this link right here. So switch to the full version, and basically right here you can configure your project metadata. So go ahead and change these according to your company or project name. But for this tutorial, I'm going to leave everything as is apart from the Java version. So I'm going to pick Java 11 because I do have it installed. But if you don't have Java 11, go ahead and pick Java 8 because it will also work. Then if you scroll down, you can see that right here you have a bunch of dependencies. And this is why Spring Boot is pretty much one of the best Java frameworks for building applications. So they give you a lot of flexibility with these dependencies, which simply means that you can install one of these dependencies and start coding right away instead of you having to configuring and setting up things. So basically you just have to install these dependencies and then start implementing whatever you want. So you can see that they have a bunch of sections right here. So web, so servlet web applications with Spring MVC and Tomcat, Jersey, WebSockets, template engines, security. So they make it very easy for you to configure security within your applications. So it saves you the hassle of having to implement security the right way. So basically, they're doing the difficult job, which is implementing the security, and then giving you this nice package that you can just plug and play. And then you have SQL, so MySQL, H2, JDBC, Postgres, Flyway for database migrations, Mongo, and then you can scroll down, you can see that they have a lot of great things. So for this video right here, let's go ahead and focus on picking this dependency right here. So web, servlet web applications with Spring MVC and Tomcat. So I'm going to take that and then generate a project. So right here, you see that I've got this demo zip, which I'm going to open in my desktop. There we go. So now I'm going to click on this zip folder. And if I delete the actual zip, you can see that now I have this folder right here. So for this video, I'm going to be using IntelliJ, which is by far the best IDE. And if you want to learn about IntelliJ, go ahead and check my video on YouTube, which I show you how to download, install, and configure IntelliJ properly. And if you are using NetBeans or Eclipse, this will also work. So inside of IntelliJ, so I actually recommend you to download and install IntelliJ if you don't have it, to follow along. And I'm pretty sure that you're going to learn great things with IntelliJ throughout this video. So what I'm going to do now is pretty much click on open and then navigate to desktop and then open up this demo folder and then open up the actual pom.xml. So I'm going to open that up and then open as project. So I'm going to allow and just give it a second. Maven is resolving the dependencies for this project. There we go. So that's nice and done. So let's go ahead and explore this project. So open up demo, and inside demo, you can see that you have a couple of folders, but the ones that we really care about are the pom.xml. So if I open that up, you can see that this is what you saw when configuring the project with Spring Initializer. So you saw the group ID, artifact, name, and then version. So this is the version right here. And then this is Java 11. And basically the actual dependency that we picked was this one right here. So Spring Boot Starter Web. And by default, Spring Boot ships with Spring Boot Starter Test for writing unit and integration tests. So go ahead and close this because we don't need it. And open up the source folder. So open up source and then main, and you can see that you have Java, and then inside you should have a class called demo application, and inside of this class you have this public static void main method, and this is how you pretty much just run your Spring application. And if I play, so make sure you play this, just give it a second, you should see that I have Spring up and running, and you can see that it says that Tomcat started on port 8080. So right here, we could change this port, but this is the default port for Tomcat. So I'm going to stop this, and you can see that everything is up and running fine. So I'm going to stop this and then collapse this. And then inside of resources, you have static, templates, and application.properties. So static is where all the web resources live for web applications. And then you have templates, and this is where you have all the templates for your web application. So usually you would use something like Mustache or EJS. And then you have this application.properties. So this is where all the properties for your application do live. And the cool thing about properties is that you can define properties for different environments. So you could have a demo environment, a test environment, and a production environment with different values for the actual properties. So it's pretty cool. So I'm going to cancel out of that. And now that you know the actual structure and make sure that you can start the application, you've successfully managed to start a Tomcat server with Spring Boot. So now let's go ahead and implement our API with all of those resources, controllers, services, and defining a database as well. So if I go back to this diagram, so remember that I said we had the API layer, controller or controller layer, and then we have a service layer for business logic, and then database for data access. So let's go ahead and start things right here. So we're gonna start right here, and in fact, just let me put a dot right here so you just know what we're doing. So if I remove that, basically let's put just a dot so we know where we are with things. So right here, and then if I collapse that, so basically we're going to implement this section first and then move our way up. So basically we're going to implement one step at a time and then see everything working fine and then implement some other functionality. So let's go ahead and go back to IntelliJ, and the first thing that I want you to do is to create a package. So let's go ahead and create a package, and right here simply call it API. So this is where the API will live. Go ahead and create a second package and simply say model. Go ahead and create a third package, call it service. Go ahead and create a fifth package, or actually a fourth package, and call it, so we need the actual DAO, and I think this is it. So we have API, DAO, model, and service, and basically these packages are representing this diagram. So if I go back, and perhaps you haven't seen me like right clicking, so new and then a package. So basically I tend to use a lot of keyboard shortcuts, and this is how I am productive with IntelliJ. So if I press Control and then enter, you can see the keyboard shortcut down below, and basically then that gives me the ability to create a new package. So the same if I for example create a variable. So if I say var and then hello equals to 2, and then if I press command and then Y, you can see the keyboard down below, right? So I've just deleted that line. So also let me go ahead and say okay. So now what we need to do is actually define our model. So what is the actual model for this application? So if I go back to this diagram, so let's go ahead and define a model. So I'm going to copy this stereotype, and you can grab this diagram. You can find the link in the description below where you can download and see exactly everything that we're doing here. So basically the actual model, so the model for this tutorial will be a person, and basically a person will have an ID, so an ID, and let's keep things simple and have, like, let's say a full, or actually name, just like that. So obviously you could have more properties, but I want to keep it simple so you see exactly what's happening, and so things become really obvious to you. So we have this model right here called person. Let's go ahead and define this in actual code. So go back to IntelliJ, and inside of the model package, go ahead and create a new class and simply call this person, right? So the kind, it's a class, and then press enter. So now simply go ahead and say private final, and then the ID will be of type UID, and simply call it ID. Go ahead and simply say private final and then string. So this is the actual name. And then I'm going to add these two constructors. So you can see I'm using keyboard shortcuts again, and then the getters. So just like that. And there we go. So now we have a model that we can work with. So if I go back, so now we have to define the actual database, section right here, right? So let's define the actual interface that will allow us to have any implementation for our database. So inside of the DAO, go ahead and create a class and then simply say person and then DAO. So instead of a class, change this to an interface. And this is the actual interface where we're going to define the operations allowed or the actual contract for anyone that wishes to implement this interface. And the cool thing about it is that we can then use dependency injection to switch between implementations with just one line of code. So let's go ahead and define our very first method. So for our database, we want to insert a person into the actual database. So we will simply return an integer, and basically we're going to mock a database using like a list, and basically we will return 0 or 1 depending whether the actual data is persisted to the actual database. So let's simply go ahead and say insert and then person, and this will take a UID, which is the actual ID, and then a person, just like that, and then end that with semicolon. Now let's also go ahead and create a default method, and basically this will be the same thing, or actually sorry, this will be integer, so it will be the same thing, and let's simply call this add and then person, and right here we will simply take person, right? And what this allows us to do is to actually generate the UIDs ourselves, or the actual ID. So UID, and then let's call it ID equals 2, and then UID dot, and then random UID, and then simply say return, and then insert person, passing the ID, and then the actual person. Yeah. So basically we have two methods, one that allows us to insert person with a given ID, and the other one without an ID, and the ID is simply randomly generated. Now let's go ahead and create a class that will implement this interface. So open up the DAO package and then simply create a class and call it person and call it fake, and then person data access and then service. And then this guy implements and then person DAO, just like that, and then implement the methods, and we need to implement insert person, right? So right here, let's go ahead and define our list. So private and then static and then list, and this will be a list of person. Simply call it DB equals to a new and then array list, just like that. Or in fact, we could even initialize this inside of a static block if we wanted. So now to insert a person, all we have to do is simply add to this database right here. So for the sake of this, simply go ahead and say DB dot and then add and then new and then person, and let's simply take the actual ID and then simply say person dot and then get name, right? So, and finally, let's simply go ahead and return 1. So we know that it always works. So the insertion always works. So now let's go ahead and actually define the actual service. So inside of the service package, go ahead and create a new class and then simply call it person and then service. And right here inside of this class, let's simply have a method to insert a new person. So simply go ahead and say public and then int and then add and then person. And basically this will take a person. And what we want to do is simply say return. And right here, we need to actually get a reference of the actual person DAO. So let's go ahead and simply say private and then final and then person DAO, and make sure that you get the actual interface and not the concrete class. So don't get the actual fake person data access service because I want to show you exactly how to use dependency injection. So then what we need to do is add this to the constructor, and now we can simply say person DAO dot and then insert and then person. So remember, we had two methods, and if I go back to my interface, so person DAO, and in fact I need to call this the same, so let's be consistent, so person, so insert person actually. So now you can see that the error went away. So basically we have the option of providing the ID or not. So in this case, let's go ahead and have it randomly generated because we don't care. But if you need to generate the ID yourself, you know that you can do it. So now that we have the service done, let's go ahead and implement the actual API. So inside of the API package, go ahead and create a class and simply call it person and then resource. Or actually, let's go ahead and say controller. So in Spring Boot world, we tend to name these as controllers. So, and then simply say okay. And then let's go ahead and also have a reference to the actual service. So private, final, and then person service. And then right here, we need to add this to the constructor. And then let's simply go ahead and have a method that adds a person. So public, and then simply say void. So we don't want to return an integer in this case. So we want to return a status code of 200. Or if anything fails, we can pretty much throw an exception. So, or you could also have your custom exceptions if you wish. So let's go ahead and simply say add and then person, and this will take a person. So person, just like that. And then what we need to do is actually say person service dot and then add person, just like that. So up to this point, we simply have normal Java classes, and to be honest, we're not even using Spring framework at this point. So let's go ahead and configure everything to start using Spring framework. So let's go ahead and open up the actual DAO, so fake person data access service. And you see right here inside of the actual service, we have a reference to it. So person DAO, and basically we are trying to use dependency injection. So if I was to run this wouldn't work because this person DAO is not instantiated, and there's no way for this constructor to know about it, right? So this is where we use annotations to instantiate beans. So open up the fake person data access service, and the way that we tell Spring that this class needs to be instantiated as a bean so that we can inject it in other classes is simply by saying at and then repository, right? So you could also say at and then component. So this is the exact same thing, but at repository makes it obvious that this class is served as a repository, right? So now that we have a repository, let's go ahead and configure the actual service. So for service, you might take a guess. So this will be at and then service, right? And you could also use at and then component if you wish. But I usually prefer to be, specific, so anyone looking at my code know exactly that this is a service. So now that we pretty much annotated the actual data access service, and right here we are injecting, right? So we are injecting into the actual constructor. So the way that we inject is simply saying at and then auto wired. So basically we are auto wiring into this interface, right? So now, because we can have multiple implementations of this interface right here, we must have a way to distinguish between them, right? And this is when you use at and then qualifier, right? So at qualifier, and then right here you can give it a name. So fake and then DAO. And basically I need to go back to my fake person data access service, and then right here I'm going to name this as fake and then DAO. And what this allows me to do is to have multiple implementations, and basically all I need to do is, for example, if I have, for example, a Postgres or MongoDB implementation, I simply say Mongo, just like that, and then I don't have to change anything. So let's go ahead and use the fake DAO, and now this is wired correctly. So finally, let's go ahead and open up the actual API package and then person controller. Let's also go ahead and simply say at and then auto wired, and basically Spring Boot injects the actual service into this constructor. And if you want to learn more about dependency injection, go ahead and check my channel. I made a video specific on dependency injection and why it's important for you to know about it. So now remember that I said that this class right here, so the API, if I go back to our diagram, is this one right here. And right here we can specify HTTP methods. So get, post, delete, and put. So these clients right here, right? So they have to issue some requests to our backend. So right now there is no code that tells that this method right here will be served as a post or put or get or delete. And also this class is not available as a REST controller. So to do that, we need to use a special annotation and simply say add and then REST controller, right? So this is a REST controller class that we can have some methods and then expose some endpoints that clients can consume. So in our case, what we want to do is have this method right here to be served as a post request. So basically, gets is for retrieving data from your server, posts is to adding a resource to your server, put modifying, and then delete for deleting a resource from your server. So to tell Spring that this method will be used as a post request, we simply use the annotation at and then post and then mapping. And this is all we have to do. Now, so obviously, we want to add a person from a client, right? So go ahead and download Postman. So Postman allows you to pretty much just serve as a client, because we don't have, for example, a React application or an Android app, or we don't have any client, right? So we can use Postman as our client, right? So go ahead and download Postman. It's an amazing client, and what we need to do is actually send a person to our server. So before we do that, so let me actually clear everything here, and basically go ahead and say post, and then this will be local host column and then 8080 and then / and then simply say API / and then v1 and then person, right? So after you define the actual endpoint, go ahead to the actual body and then simply say raw, and then instead of text, go ahead and send a JSON. So we want to send a JSON payload to the actual server, and remember we have name, and let's say that this is James and then Bond. So basically we want to send James Bond to the server. So in order for us to do that, we have to do a few things. One is we have to define these properties in our Pojo, so that when we send this JSON, Spring knows to take this property and then convert that into a Java class, right? So in order for us to do that, what we need to do is open up person. So inside of the model package, open up person, and then you see right here in the constructor, let's go ahead and define some properties. So at JSON property, and this will be the ID. And then right here, so if I put this on a new line, at and then JSON property, and this will be the actual name, right? So you could also define more properties, but as I said, let's keep this simple so that you understand exactly what's going on. So if I open up Postman again, So right here, you see that name. So this name right here matches the property that we have in our class person. And if we wanted to send the ID, so we would simply say ID and then pass, an ID. But we are generating the ID from the server, therefore we don't need to send it. Now, what I need to do is actually tell that we are receiving this JSON payload from the actual body. So inside of person controller, go ahead and you see right here where you add a person. So right here, simply annotate this with @ and then request and then body, right? So we are simply saying that we want to take the request body and then shovel that inside of this person. And then because we have, because we have this property right here, we will simply turn this JSON object into a person. That's all we're saying. And the final thing that we have to do is actually define this path right here, right? So right here, before REST controller, simply say @ and then request and then mapping, and the actual mapping will be API v1 and then person. So this is all you need to do in order to create your very first endpoint with Spring Boot. Now what we need to do is actually test it. So let's go ahead and simply play the application. So as you can see, Tomcat started on port 8080. Now if I open up Postman and then simply send this request right here, you can see that we have a 200 status code. And this means that the request went through fine. Now, obviously, we don't have a way of testing this, right? Because we don't have an endpoint to retrieve people from our database. So let's go ahead and define the functionality to get people from our database. So let me go ahead and open up IntelliJ, and if I collapse that, so go ahead and open up the person DAO, and let's go ahead and say that this will return a list of person and say select all people. And then let's go ahead and open up the person data access service. So we need to implement that. And then right here, what we need to do is very simple, return the actual database and open up service. So right here, simply create a method, public, and then list of person, get, and then all people. And then this will return person DAO dot and then select all people. So now we need to define the actual resource or the actual method that will serve as the get request. So simply say public and then list of and then person and then get all people. And then what we're going to return is the actual person service dot and then get all people, right? So now we need to tell that this method will be served as a get request. And the way that you do it is simply by saying @ and then get and then mapping. So you see that everything has the same pattern: @ post mapping, @ get mapping. Now let me go ahead and pretty much just restart the server. There we go. So the actual server started on port 8080. So open up Postman. And then let's actually try and send the actual same request. So we're going to send James Bond. You can see that worked. And now let's go ahead and try and perform a get request to our server. So the exact same URL, send. And there we go. So you can see that we have an array with one person that comes from our database. So this is awesome. Now let's go ahead and perform another post. So right here, so change this to Nelson and then Mandela. You can change this to whatever name you want, to be honest. I'm going to send that. You can see that it's 200, and then simply change this to Anna and then Jones. Send. And now if I perform a GET request to our server, you can see that we have 3 people. So James Bond, Nelson, and Anna Jones. So as you see, Spring Boot is just incredible. It's super fun. And as you saw, like, it didn't take us long to implement this functionality, right? We're just using annotations to drive our implementation, which is awesome. And we can pretty much deliver results very fast using Spring Boot. Now let's go ahead and implement the other 2 HTTP methods, the ability to update a person as well as deleting a person. So open up IntelliJ. If I collapse this and then open up the actual DAO, and let's define the actual interface or actual method. So right here, simply say int and delete and then person by ID. And right here, we need to pass the actual ID. So UID and then ID. And let's also define a couple of things. So let's also define that we want to update a person. So this will return an integer and then simply say update and then person by ID. So right here, we're going to pass the actual ID and the actual new person that we want to update, right? So person. And also let's define one more method, and this will be an optional of and then person, and then simply say select person by and then ID, and then simply pass the actual ID inside, and there we go. So now let's go ahead and open up the fake person data access service, and we have to implement all of those methods. So I'm pressing Alt and then enter and then implement methods. And you can see that we have these 3 methods that we need to implement. Okay. And errors gone. So in fact, let's go ahead and implement select person by ID first. So to implement this method, what we need to do is actually search within our database and see whether we have a person with the given ID. So this one right here. So the way we do it is simply by streaming our database. So let's go ahead and use Java streams dot and then stream. And if you want to learn more about streams, go ahead and check my video on Java streams where I cover this. So let's go ahead and simply say filter, and right here we get a person. And then let's simply say that person dot and then get ID dot equals to ID, right? And then what we want is dot and then find and then first. And there we go. So now let's go ahead and open up the actual service and then simply implement the same method here. So public, and then this will be an optional of and then person, and then get person by ID, and then simply pass the actual ID. And you can see that it's almost the same thing that we're doing. And right here, return, and then person DAO dot and then get, or actually select person by ID, and then pass the ID, and then open up the controller. So person controller, and this will be a get. So basically we want to public, so this will be a person, and then get and then person by ID, and then we're going to pass the ID, and I'm going to show you exactly how do we get that. So ID, and then what we want to do is simply say return and then person service dot get person by ID, lowercase ID, and then dot or else, and then no. So right here you could actually have a custom message or a custom exception or a custom code thrown to the actual client. So for example, a 404 with a message saying user not found. But for this video, let's go ahead and keep it simple and simply return null, right? So now what we want to do is, if I open a Postman, is you see this ID right here, right? So I want to be able to copy the ID and then simply say / and then pass the ID. And then when I send the request, I should get that person back, right? So the way that we get the ID from the path is by simply using an annotation. And the annotation is called, so this one is @ and then path and then variable. And the path variable that we want is an ID. So ID, just like that. And basically this is the type right here. So now let's go ahead and define the actual mapping. So this will be @ and then get and then mapping. And now because we want to have the actual ID in the path, so inside simply say path, and then what you want is double quotes and then curly brackets and then pass ID. So basically this will allow you to have / and then some ID, and then right here you're simply grabbing that ID and then turning that into a UID, right? So let's go ahead and test this. So if I pretty much just restart the actual server, there we go, up and running. So if I open a Postman, now we need to issue some requests. So you can see that, every time that we restart the server, we lose everything from our list. That's a disadvantage of having an in-memory database. But for this video, you can see exactly how everything works. So let's go ahead and send a post request there. And then let's get everyone. So remove the actual UID there. So send. So we have Nelson right there. And basically now we can grab Nelson's ID and then do a / and then paste that, right? So now if I send, you can see that we have only one object, right? It's not an array, but it's an object. And if I was to change the ID for something that doesn't exist, send, you can see that actually it's a bad request because the UID is completely wrong. So it's not a valid UID that I've just sent to the server, but you get the idea. So if I go ahead and let's go ahead and add Anna Jones, so send, and then let's get everyone, and let's grab Anna Jones ID right there, and then / send that. You can see that works, right? And in fact, let me go ahead and say UID generator, and let me generate a UID. So I want one UID here, and if I grab this and then go back to Postman and then perform a GET request with that UID there. So if I delete everything and then paste that UID and then send, you see that it's a 200, but we have nothing in our database with that UID, right? So as I said, so you should be throwing a 404 with a custom exception, but in this video you can see exactly that we are returning nothing because there is no one with that UID against our database. So let's go ahead and implement the remaining methods. So if I collapse this, so let's go ahead and implement everything in one go now. So open up the actual fake person data access service, and to delete a person, what we need to do is simply get the person. If the person is there, delete it, otherwise return 0. So let's go ahead and simply say select and then person by ID. We're going to grab the ID. And remember, this returns an optional, so person and then maybe. And right here, let's simply say if, and then person maybe dot, and then is empty. So if it is empty, we want to return 0. Otherwise, what we want to do is actually remove from the database, right? So if it's there, we want to remove. So db dot, and then remove, and then person maybe dot, and then get, just like that, and then return 1, right? So we know that we did delete this person. Now let's go ahead and implement update person. So what we're going to do is simply say return and then get, or actually select person by ID. We're going to pass the ID, and then what we want to do is say dot and then map. So right here we get a person, let's call it P. So P. And as I said, if you want to learn about Java streams, maps, operations, filtering, go ahead and check my YouTube video where I teach all of this. So now let's go ahead and try and get the actual index of this person. So int and then index of and then person to delete equals 2 and then db dot and then index of and then pass the actual person, right? So now we have an index. So I'm going to say if the actual index to delete, and I'm missing an E right there. So if the index to delete is greater or equal to 0, what we want to do is actually set the actual person. So it means that we found someone, right? So let's go ahead and say db dot and then set and then index of the person to delete, and then simply pass the actual person, right? And now what we can do is simply return 1 right here. So otherwise, so else, or we can simply say return and then 0. And then right here, so because we need to return an integer, simply say dot and then or else, and then 0, right? So basically, if I format this, so basically I'm saying select the person and then map that person to something else, right? And if the actual index of that person is greater or equal to 0, we know that we found that person, and then set the contents of that person to the new person that we've just received from the client, and then return 1, everything is fine. Otherwise return 0, or if select person by ID is not present, we don't do anything and simply return 0. So this is what it means. So now let's go ahead and simply feed this through the service as well as controller and then test it. So let's go ahead and simply open up person service. So let's go ahead and say public and then int delete and then person. And then right here, we're going to take the actual ID. So ID, and then this will be very simple. All we need to do is simply say return and then person DAO dot and then delete by ID, pass the actual ID, and we're done. To update a person, sorry, so if I close that. So to update a person, what we need to do is simply say public and then int update and then person. So we're going to take the actual ID, so UID and then ID, and then this person is the new person, so new and then person, right? And then what we need to do is simply say return person DAO dot and then update and then ID, right? So you can see that I don't have much logic going on here, and this is because I'm just teaching you exactly how to use Spring Boot to create an API. But essentially, inside of this service, you'd have whatever logic your application requires, right? So I'm just making it simple for you to understand exactly, so you don't have a lot of code going on, and basically you see the entire process of what we are doing. So now let me go back to the actual person controller and simply expose those to a REST API. So the first one is update, or actually delete. So let's go ahead and say delete. So public, and then void, and then delete, and then person by ID. We simply pass the ID, and pretty much the same thing at, and then path variable, and then this will be the ID, and then we want that to be a UID ID, and then return, or actually there's no need to return here because this is void. So simply say person service dot, and then delete person, pass the ID. Now this has to be, guess what, at, and then remember we are deleting a resource from the server, so delete and then mapping. So now inside we have to have the path and then the actual ID, right? So this ID is this one right here, which we can pass down to the service. So let's also go ahead and implement the actual update. So the update will be at, and then put, and then mapping, and public, and then void, and then update person, and then this will take a person from the request body. So at, and then request body will take a person to update. There we go. And now simply say person service dot, and then update. And in fact, we also need the actual path. So the path will include the actual ID. So ID, and let's go ahead and say that at, and then path, and then variable, and that will contain the ID. And this will be a UID, and then call it ID, and there we go. So now we can pass ID and then person to update, right? And to be honest, this is all we have to do to implement our REST API. So let's go ahead and test it. So I'm gonna pretty much just restart the server. So let me go ahead and open a Postman. So let's start with one person. So let me send this request, and then let me get everyone. So send, you see that we have Nelson Mandela. So let's go ahead and change Nelson's name to something else. So go ahead and simply create a new request. So go ahead and change this to a put, and the body, so instead of saying Nelson Mandela, let's simply say that this is Alex and then Corin, right? And now let's go ahead and simply pass Nelson's Mandela right here, and basically we're just changing his name. So if I go ahead and send, you can see that the request did work. And now if I get everyone from our database, so if I perform a get request and then send, you can see that that didn't work. And let's go ahead and debug this in a second. But for now, let's go ahead and pretty much try and delete this person. So Nelson Mandela. So if I put / and then the actual ID, and then delete, and then send, we got 200. If we get everyone, you see that Nelson is not there and it's been deleted. So we had a bug. So if I post, let's go ahead and post Anna Jones, and basically we couldn't update the actual name. So if I get Anna Jones, get the actual ID, and then perform a put, and this will be Anna Jones ID, just like that, and then body, and then let's simply say update, and then update, send, still a 200. But if we get everyone, you see that's still Anna Jones. So we have a bug. So let's go ahead and try and find out why exactly this is happening. So let me go back to IntelliJ and then close this and then open up the actual data access service. And now this is the actual method. So we are selecting the person, mapping, and then so basically, so right here we have index of person to delete. So this should be actual update. So to update, and db index of person. So basically, yes. So this is the error. So right here, so you see that we have, so this person right here, so this is what we want to update. So right, so let me rename this to update, right? So the index of person to update, you know, it's -1. So this will always return 0. So what we want is actual P. So P is the actual person. And in fact, just let me rename this to person. So we want this person that we found. So person, and then this should return the actual index. And then if it's bigger or equal to 0, what we want is new. So because this update doesn't contain the actual ID, so we need new person and then pass the ID and then simply say update dot and then get name. So yeah, I think this makes more sense. So let's go ahead and restart the server. There we go. So now if I open up Postman and then pretty much just get, so let's start from scratch. So no one in the database. Let's go ahead and post Anna Jones. And now we have to get, let's go ahead and get. So we get the actual UID of Anna Jones. And then right here, let's go ahead and perform a put to this endpoint and simply pass Anna Jones UID or ID. And then in the actual body, let's also change this to Anna and then Montana, just like that. And then if we send, so we go 200 and now this should work. So go ahead and send and ta-da. So you can see that this now works. So you see that we pretty much just managed to implement all of the methods defined in our API. So it is nice to have like tests for everything right here. And basically I wrote tests for this class. So go ahead and download the repo down below and you can run all the tests and see that this works as expected. So I've got unit tests around all of this. So one last thing that I want to mention is that you see inside of this person controller right here. So this person controller, we can have you know, some annotations that enforce nullability in our application. So we can pretty much just use some annotations and enforce that this object right here is always present and also valid. So go ahead and open up person model. And then right here, what we can do is actually say that this field right here, so the actual name, this cannot be blank. So at and then not and then blank, right? So the reason why I'm not saying not null is because if you have an empty string, it's not null. But if you have an empty string, it's actually blank. So basically we don't want that to be blank, right? So then go back to the actual controller. And now you can say that the request body, so this has to be so at and then valid, right? And then we can also say that this must not be null. So we could also do the same here. So we can enforce that this is valid and also at and then not null, right? So now if I pretty much restart the server, so you see exactly what we're doing. So basically we want to fail as soon as possible instead of having to deal with nullability inside of our code. So now let's go ahead and open up Postman, and then let's go ahead and pretty much try and post someone to our database. So right here, so you see that we have Anna Jones, but if we send, for example, blank, so send, you see that we get an error. And basically this is working as expected. So you see that it's a bad request, and it's pretty much saying that validation failed for object person right here. So this is awesome. And you can see the actual default message, which says that the field name must not be blank. So now if I go ahead and add the correct payload, so right here, so let's go ahead and say John and then Jones and then send, you can see that we have a 200 status code. And if I go ahead and get everyone, you can see that we have John Jones. So this is it, to be honest. So now you should be familiar with Spring Boot and writing APIs for your applications. So now the cool thing about it is that you can have a client API and then do all kinds of things depending on your application. So one more thing actually that I forgot to show you is dependency injection, right? So let's say that we want to have a Postgres implementation, right? Another database or connecting to a different database. So how do we change that without changing pretty much anything apart from one line of code? So to do that, what we need to do is open up the actual DAO package and then simply create a new class. And right here, simply call it, for example, person. Let's simply call it person, and then data access and then service, right? Let's simply call it that. So this is the real thing now. So okay, implements and then person DAO, and then implement all the methods. And then right here, so when we select everyone, let's simply return list dot and then of and then new and then person uid dot random uid, and then let's simply say from Postgres DB, right? So now what we need to do is annotate this with @ and then repository, and then simply say that this is a Postgres implementation, right? And then to change our implementation, right, all we have to do is grab this name right here and then go where you inject the actual interface, which is inside of the service, right? So person service. So now instead of fake DAO, simply use Postgres like that. Now if I restart the actual server and then open up Postman, now if I perform a get, you can see that we pretty much switched our database with just one line of code. And you can see that this now is coming from a Postgres database. So I'm actually planning to do a video on, connecting to a real Postgres database, but go ahead and check my channel because I've got a video on how to spin up a Postgres container using Docker and also an example with Spring Boot. So go ahead and check my video on that, but I'm going to make a second part on this video connecting to a real database. So the last thing that I want to show you exactly how to spin up everything. So go ahead and stop your server. Now what I want to show you is actually how to spin up the actual jar. So this is the jar that you can deploy to a server and have your application up and running. So I'm gonna simply collapse that, and then inside of Maven, so go ahead and open up this tab right here, so Maven, and you should see a target folder. So if you don't see that, so if I delete that, simply go ahead and open up Lifecycle and then simply say install. There we go. So this is actually running some tests. And there we go. You see that we have a target folder right here. So inside of the target folder, go ahead and simply right click and then open in terminal. So you should see that we have this demo 001 snapshot.jar, and this is what we can pretty much just run on the actual server, right? So when you deploy this to any environment. So just to show you, so if I open a Postman, so if I send the request, you see that the server is not up and running. So to kick off this jar, all you have to do is simply say Java, and right here, so if I scroll up, you can see that. So if I scroll up, you can see that we can say Java and then -jar and then pass the actual jar. So go ahead and simply say Java minus and then jar and then the actual jar. So the jar name is demo. And then if I press tab, you can see that we get auto completion. And then all I have to do is press enter. And you can see that now we are starting our server. So right here, Tomcat started on port 8080. And what I'm going to do now is simply open up my web browser. And this is the actual API that you would use. So localhost and then 8080 and then API and then v1 and then person and then enter. And there we go. So you see that we have a JSON that we can consume, and basically you can distribute this and have thousands of clients consume your API. So I hope you had fun implementing this application or this API with Spring Boot, and basically we achieved everything. So we have a client. So in our case it was Postman. We implemented get, post, delete, and put requests through the actual controller layer. We had a service layer, data access layer for a database. You saw how to implement an in-memory database, and then you saw how easy it was to switch from databases, and then we return the actual response to the actual client, which is what you see right here. So as I said, I'm going to do a second part on this video. I really want to add value by connecting to a real Postgres instance, which, to be honest, is not going to be a lot of work. As you saw, it's just switching one line of code and then implementing the actual connectivity to Postgres. So if you have any questions, go ahead and comment down below. Otherwise, make sure to subscribe to my channel to get more videos like this. Also visit my website where I've got a video teaching all of this in detail, and check out my Instagram where the community is growing. And as I said, if you have any questions, comment down below. And also, if you don't have any questions, please comment down below and tell me what you thought about this video. This is all for now. Make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one. See ya.